Hello all. This is the first part of what will probably be, I don't know, maybe two or three video lectures on literary theory and critical perspectives. Basically what this is, it's just a brief overview of Appendix 5. Um, it's important for us to just sort of get a basic introduction of these because we'll be referring to several of these as we do our analyses and interpretations of stories. Um, so literary theory, critical perspectives, literary criticism, while these terms are slightly different, for the most part, they mean basically the same thing. So we'll probably end up using these interchangeably. Um, and what you need to know is that they are the particular methods of inquiry used to explore the nature and value of literature and academic criticism. So this is a more, if you're sort of thinking in a top-down way, theory being that larger overall top part of an upside down pyramid. Literary theory is that middle part, and then critical perspectives is that fine tooth point. And what we're going to do here, this video lecture is just going to briefly and honestly introduce these different forms of these different critical perspectives. So formalist criticism, it's the most basic approach to analysis, and this mostly focuses on the form, as we call it, the form of the piece of literature, not so much the content. We're looking more at style, what literary movement it's associated with, the conventions, the genre, those sorts of things. And this focuses on how all of the elements are integrated into the complexity and structure for more of an aesthetic purpose. We're not necessarily looking at the content, the story. It's more an analysis of how the story is executed. Okay. Like I said, that's the most basic one. Most of what we're going to do is going to jump off from that point. Biographical criticism and psychological criticism. These are probably the two of the other more important ones that we're going to come back to time and time again. So biographical criticism. And psychological criticism, I really think these two very much go together, but we can do these separately. So specifically looking at the Poe stories, for example, Poe's biography, his personal experiences, and his psychology as the writer, both greatly influence his work. So biographical criticism really is understanding that literature is created by humans, so thus it's important to know how their individual human experiences influence their work. So understanding that author's life will aid in the analysis and interpretation of the work. All right. Psychological criticism is just a slight shift on that, but there are three different sort of angles to psychological criticism. So first, the most broad part of psychological criticism involves investigating the nature of literary genius and forming your analysis based off of what we know about the psychology of writers in general, which we're going to get to here soon at the end of week 2. The more common approach is understanding the writer's psychological state and how that influences the work. So understanding Poe's biography, and then beyond his biography, his mental state, his psychopathologies can tell us more about his work. You see psychological criticism becoming very popular with 20th century writers after we know, as a society, after we understand more about psychology. So when we get into Hemingway's story this week, a lot of our criticism and our analysis and interpretation, a lot of it is going to come from knowing what we know now about Hemingway's psychopathology. We can also analyze the psychoanalyze fictional characters, their behavior. Well, we can glean a lot. So if you go back to the Poe stories, we know that the narrator in The Telltale Heart truly is most likely insane. He's suffering some kind of psychotic break. and we can use that to analyze that story more clearly. There's a fourth approach that I personally subscribe to, but it's not necessarily listed as one of the facets of psychological criticism. And that fourth aspect, that fourth facet of psychological criticism, is that we can also analyze and interpret the author's purpose, sort of what their I'm sorry, my dog is freaking out. Bruce, stop. Whatever that point is that the reader ends up at, whatever that emotional state, that whatever they think, feel, believe, we can use psychological criticism to analyze how the work affects the reader and their experience of the work. All right. Oh, sorry, it's taking forever to switch over. All right, historical criticism. This is sort of similar to biographical criticism, but this focuses more on the sociology and historically what was going on at that time. So understanding that historical context can help us analyze and interpret the work in a more, in a clearer fashion. A great example of this is The Great Gatsby, honestly, in that understanding the Jazz Age, the era of Prohibition, the era of bootlegging, all of those are crucially important to the further analysis of the novel itself. And part of this is we can also emphasize the prescience of the work on its original readers. So The Great Gatsby, for example, was way ahead of its time, and it wasn't appreciated. It was actually a failure when it was first published. It wasn't until much later that it became the example of the Jazz Age. It became the quintessential novel, really the essential piece of literature from that time period. All right, reader response criticism. Basically, everything we're going to do is every analysis and interpretation we are going to do is going to have some reader response elements to it. So the fundamental aspect of reader response criticism is that it postulates that reading is as creative of an act as writing. That's a bit hyperbolic, but the reader is an active part of the experience. Going back to image and imagination, the writer's taking what's in their imagination, the story that they're envisioning, and according to Stephen King, he likes to use this analogy of telepathy. The writer is then telepathically putting that image into the reader's head, and they need to put the pieces together, see it, interpret it, and add their own meaning to it. So this, fundamentally, reader response criticism is based on the idea that every individual reader is going to have their own unique response to a piece of literature. So reading and writing both utilize imagination and intelligence. You can't just passively, sort of ingest the reading. You have to actively participate in the process of reading. And analysis and interpretation is derived from the fact that readers have different responses to work and even have different responses at different periods in their lives, which is truly fascinating. Going back to The Great Gatsby, it's actually very interesting how when you read it, a lot of us read it in high school and totally don't get it. It's not until you're older that, a lot of scholars, including myself, argue that you truly understand The Great Gatsby. It's not until you have experienced loss and that desire to sort of relive the past that the story actually makes sense. So, you have different responses at different times in your life. This is just a great example, but there's tons and tons and tons of other examples like this. All right, post-structuralist and deconstructionist. These are essentially the same thing. I'm combining them here. For our purposes, they're going to be the same thing. So these focus on the multiple and often contradictory meanings of literature. And it's built on this following logical syllogism, which is that language is fundamentally unstable, its meaning changes. Literary texts are composed of language, therefore literary texts are fundamentally unstable. So what this means is that we have to remove as many variables as possible, such as removing the author, death of the author. What we're saying here is that, Charles Bukowski, for example, a great writer, a fantastic writer, but he was, during his life, much of his work was considered sort of lowbrow. It's very gritty. He was often called the poet laureate of Skid Row. All of his work focused on sort of the people who inhabited the slums of Los Angeles in like post-World War II America. It wasn't until pretty late in his life, he died in 1994, probably wasn't until the late 80s, that he began to gain some respect for his work. But since his death, he's now considered one of the greatest writers of the 20th century. So we have this problem. Is it that his work was unappreciated? Or is it that since he has died, that his work never was really that good, and just because he has died, now people think it's good? You see this a lot with visual artists too, that during their lives, their work is not really highly regarded. It's after they die that they become famous and renowned and respected. Other elements to this have to do with the idea of time. So, for example, the Poe stories, the structure, the language, some of Poe's stories, they're excellent. The Fall of the House of Usher is by far my favorite story of his. It would never be written in the way that it is today, because the first 2 pages are entirely backstory. There's no action. And in 21st century literature, that's just not acceptable. We don't have it's argued that we don't have the attention span for that. So you jump right into the action, and then you put the backstory in when it's necessary. So if we sort of remove all of those variables of how great Poe was and how he was the first at a lot of things, if we just look at this as a piece of writing without all of those other, all that other meaning attached to it, we run into some problems. So that's what post-structuralist and deconstructionist is. We're probably not going to get into this too much. This is a little bit beyond the scope of this course. We are not going to sort of attempt to remove all of those variables. It may come up here and there, but this is not going to be that big of a focus for us. And then lastly, I only have about 2 minutes left. I'm going to try to finish this. Gender criticism. This is a broad term. This also encompasses sort of LGBTQ criticism, feminist criticism. We use gender criticism now. It emerged from feminist criticism, which is that analysis and interpretation are based on gender and sexual orientation of writers, readers, and characters. And this has a lot to do with the patriarchal society. So when it comes to gender criticism, we can take something like, like Sylvia Plath's work, and we can analyze it purely through a gender lens of her as a writer, her characters, which were most often women, and very strongly autobiographical, and then also apply some analysis and interpretation based off of her core group of readers. And nowadays, there is actually some interesting demographic information associated with some writers. For example, Hemingway is mostly read by men in their 20s, angry young men. And then really quickly, cultural criticism. I'm going to run through this. Cultural criticism is sort of a catch-all where you pull elements from all of the other ones, not necessarily advocating for one particular perspective or one particular field of study. This is basically what we're going to be doing. This is just sort of the umbrella for all of these other things, but it's important to know all of these individually. I'm going to stop there because I'm out of time.